Chapter 2, Technical Sentences. This chapter we're going to cover examining technical sentences. So the first thing we're going to look at is a typical technical description, and in this case it was written by a civil engineer. So this is a typical technical description, and as you can see, it is a bit verbose. It's a little passive and needs some revision. It's at 44 words. And here you can see it revised at 31 words. So our original we have also reviewed was the root barrier installation on the upper roof decks, which was progressing during our inspection. It was observed that the root barrier was installed. However, correction of the irrigation scoopers and waterproofing of the anchor backplates was not carried out. All of that to say, the root barrier on the upper roof decks was being installed during our inspection. However, the irrigation scuppers had not been corrected, nor had the anchor backplates been waterproofed. So, the thing we want to stress in technical and scientific writing is don't say in 44 words what you can easily say in 31 words. Think about it this way. Which version sounded better? Which of those was more clear? If you're reading a report, which style would you have rather read? Which writer sounds more confident and more competent? If you employ the following strategies, your writing will become more clear and more concise. So these are the things we're going to look at. We're going to become more clear and more concise, and we're going to do that by finding the real subject, the real verb. We're going to edit for conciseness and edit for clarity. Now remember, conciseness and clarity are two of our important things. The subject of a sentence is the topic of the sentence, and that's what the sentence is all about. The subject of a sentence is also the main noun or pronoun, the one that performs the main action. Sentences generally work best if these two coincide. So, is everything working in unison to make everything happen? And we want to do this by being as direct as possible. And being as direct as possible means, in this case, to look for the real subject of the sentence. And that's going to be the agent that you are actually talking about, the agent who is performing the main action of your sentence. Here's an example. The decision of the engineers was to double the chlorine concentration in the water treatment process. Compare that to, the engineers decided to double the chlorine concentration in the water treatment process. Here again, the drainage of runoff should be directed onto previous ground. That's not very direct. Versus runoff should be directed onto previous ground. This is much more clear. You want to make sure that you're avoiding meaningless sentence starts. These meaningless sentence openings, and the proper grammatical term here is a weak expletive. You'll want to know that. And I know what you're thinking, weak expletive. When I think expletive, even though I know what it means, I immediately think, who's swearing? That's not what we're talking about here. Here, weak expletive is a sentence opening that has no meaning in the sentence and just really delays the actual subject. There are 8 hoisting points that need to be reinforced versus 8 hoisting points need to be reinforced. So the weak expletive is there are. Yes, that makes it a more complete sentence, and if we were doing a more elaborate bit of writing, you would want to have that, of course, but here it's just creating a weak expletive because there's really not a need for it. If we're looking at conciseness and clarity, there's no need to have that there. Here, note that it is not a weak expletive if it functions as a pronoun with a clear antecedent. I left my bike here this morning. It is not here anymore. So keep that in mind. I know everybody loves English grammar rules, but if you're going to get technical, I just want you to be aware of it. Here, it is not expected that we pay immediately versus we are not expected to pay immediately versus we don't need to pay immediately. You want to engage using the active voice. So remember, we're still looking for the real subject in our sentences. We also want to look at using active voice. We want to understand the difference between active and passive voice. So active voice is when the subject of a sentence is actually performing the verb's action. So when that happens, we say that that is active voice. So sentences in the active voice have that strong, direct, and clear tone. They're clearly actually doing the action. Passive voice is when the subject is being acted upon by the verb. So here it becomes a little more complicated. You have to actually add the to be construct, and it creates sentences like bananas are adored by monkeys. So if you want more examples, you can head over to the Grammarly blog. That's where I go to get all of my excellent grammar definitions. But if the subject of the sentence is performing an action, you want to make sure that you're using active voice. So let's take a look at some examples. The instrument was carefully calibrated by the engineer versus the engineer carefully calibrated the instrument. The room was shaded by the tree versus the tree shaded the room. And here, this is in one of the cases where passive voice is actually better. The tree shaded the room isn't a consistent point of view. The room was shaded by the tree makes more sense because that's going to keep your point of view consistent, and the room was being shaded by the tree. So it makes more sense to keep it consistent that way. So take a moment and pause your video and read the passage and look at the passive voice here. Okay. Now take a moment and read active voice. So as you can see, the investigation into the Johal noise complaint was conducted on May 15th. Noise measurements were taken at 50-meter intervals in a direct line from the wind turbine toward the Johal residence. This line was deviated from at the pond, at which point measurements had to be taken around the perimeter of the pond until the original line of travel was able to be resumed. That's not very clear. So that leaves a lot of room for ambiguity, and using the passive voice is probably not the best choice versus using active voice where it seems like you're in the moment. We investigated the Johal noise complaint on May 15th, taking noise measurements at 50-meter intervals in a line from the wind turbine toward the Johal residence. We had to deviate from this line to the pond, taking measurements around its perimeter until we were able to resume the original line of travel. That's pretty straightforward and clear. So as you can see, there's no confusion with that second passage. Active voice is a much better choice. Additionally, you want to address the reader directly. Not addressing the reader directly often leads to passive constructions and weak sentence and weak clause openings. If a leak is detected versus if you detect a leak. So think about the instructions and warnings and things like that that you've read. You want to take action if you're being addressed directly, if you know it pertains to you directly. So here are some examples of that. Do not open any fitting unless accompanied by qualified personnel and it has been ascertained that the component is not pressurized. Versus, do not open any fitting unless you are qualified to do so and are certain that the component is not pressurized. The rest has too much information and it leaves too much ambiguity. Versus, hey, are you personally qualified? You as second person. In papers in prior classes, you're probably told not to use second person because it's like you're wagging a finger at the other person, like you. Here's a good thing because you want that. You want that person to visualize someone asking, like, are you qualified? One must read all safety rules and instructions before beginning work. Versus, read all safety rules and instructions before you begin work. The onus is on you. Next, we want to try to find the real verb. Even after we found the real subject, we still sometimes don't write as clearly and directly as we could. So, finding the real verb in a sentence is the next strategy for writing concisely and clearly. The programmers made a modification to the software after the technical writers had completed the documentation. Versus, the programmers modified the software after the technical writers had completed the documentation. The chemistry professor gave a demonstration of cold fusion. Versus, the chemistry professor demonstrated cold fusion. So, demonstrated versus gave a demonstration. More clear, more concise. Another thing you want to do, look for generic verbs such as give, perform, had, or affect, as in affected a change in, versus changed. Look for these at the start of verb phrases and see if you can't find the hidden verb that really defines the action performed by the subject. And you can find a table of examples of these over on, I think it's page 24 in your textbook. Here are some more examples. So, edit for conciseness. Make your sentences no more than about 20 words long on average. Typically, I would tell you that there's no right or wrong on this, but for technical writing, there is. Make your paragraphs no more than 7 lines long on average. You want to avoid huge blocks of text. Visually, it's not appealing to the eye. If it's not broken up, people will not read them. You want to avoid overly wordy expressions. There are lots more examples in the textbook, and that can be used as a resource. Just remember that in technical writing, we don't use filler. So if you find yourself with a tendency to use filler, and as you can tell from my videos, I do use a lot of words, but not filler necessarily. Look for places where you might be using filler. A lot of times we have incorporated filler sentences, filler phrases into our day-to-day life, and we don't even realize it. So again, say what you need to say in your draft, just like we have learned. Get that out there. Then go back and edit that stuff out. Have somebody else look, and once you become more cognizant of your writing quirks, it's a lot easier to be aware of them and get rid of them. I personally didn't realize how frequently I used the word that until my direct supervisor pointed it out to me. And I was so mortified because I was a fancy schmancy master's degree holder. And oh my gosh, how did I not know about this writing quirk that I had? And it was a simple thing. Hey, did you know you use that a lot? Like a lot more than you need? I'm like, me? So you don't know until you know. So just pay attention to that kind of stuff. So look for these kinds of filler. Sometimes you need these. Sometimes things might have a tendency to, and you might need to put those in, but chances are you don't. Redundancies. A lot of times we'll have redundancies and we don't even realize they are redundancies. The collapse of a structure was a terrible tragedy. Well, tragedies are terrible. That's why they're tragedies. We will use several different varieties of fasteners. Well, several and different, kind of the same thing. Several is many, different, Where in near proximity? Well, near and proximate are the same thing. So keep that in mind. Again, redundancy, it's saying the same thing twice, or it's stating the obvious. So you don't want to be like the commercial with Captain Obvious. Don't be that person. Again, though, don't worry about that when you're writing. Take the redundancies out when you're editing. There's a table of examples in your textbook. Use your textbook as a resource. When you're editing, go pull that, look for those, keep it to the side, and scroll through. Look for these things as you're editing when we actually get to something to edit. Edit for clarity. This is our last strategy for writing concisely and clearly. Are there chains of nouns? Break those up. Use simple language. Avoid jargon. I should probably start a discussion board of jargon and business phrases and technical phrases and scientific words we hate the most, because there are certain certain jargon phrases that I absolutely despise, like, it is what it is. Well, of course it is what it is. What else would it be? So if you've been out in a co-op or something like that, or out in the working world at some point, you've probably come across some of these that you also don't care for. Don't let it make its way into your writing. See if you can pull all of that out. So if at all possible, don't perpetuate the use of jargon. And what I mean by breaking up chains of nouns. The deadline for the municipal groundwater level investigation completion report is Monday morning. Oh my gosh, person, place, thing. Person, place, thing. Person, place, thing. That's what a noun is. Can you break up this mess of nouns? The deadline for the completion report on the investigation into the municipal groundwater table is Monday morning. Revised, it's a little bit better. And here's the best version. The completion report on the investigation into the municipal groundwater table is due on Monday morning. So, much better. And again, use simple language. Complementary, comprise, expenditure, indispensable, minuscule, modification, notification, reiterate. Free. Again, there's no bonus points for using extremely thesaurus-worthy words. Just keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Sorry, I have a whole bunch of these. And again, there's a bunch in your textbook that you can use as examples. Remember too, you want to avoid jargon, and keep in mind too that it can be a good thing when it functions as technical shorthand, because in that sense it speeds communication. So again, if you're writing to an audience that knows your technical shorthand, if it's audience specific, and the audience understands it, that's great. It's a problem though if it's misapplied. So if it's used in a non-technical context to mean something general and non-technical, then it becomes an issue. So there's a big long list in the textbook of commonly used jargon. It's kind of like a list for the use of simple language. Always ask yourself, what's the simplest, clearest word that I can use in this situation? Use that. Try to avoid jargon again. So I've made some improvements to the user interface. That's a good use of jargon. Versus, we need to interface about that. Yes, that kind of thing. And picture somebody like putting their fingers together and making that interface face, because I think you know what I'm talking about. Versus, we need to discuss that, which is really all you need to say. Check for gender neutral language. A taxpayer should keep his receipts for 7 years. Versus, a taxpayer should keep his/her receipts for 7 years. Versus, taxpayers should keep their receipts for 7 years. This isn't about writing more concisely or more clearly, but about writing more inclusively. So whenever possible, make the subject plural to avoid using gendered pronouns when you could be referring to a reader or subject of either gender. Avoid his/her constructions because they tend to strangle sentences. Also, it is exhausting to read this. Think about something that's continually referring to something that could be of either gender, and someone has his/her, he/she, his/her, he/she, his/her, he/she throughout the entire paper. It's exhausting to continually read that over and over and over and over again. Not to mention, there are more constructs than his/her, he/she, so using them there is a much safer, much more inclusive way to make sure that you aren't excluding anybody. And it does not strangle your sentence. It's much more pleasing, facilitates the flow of your paper in a much better way, and it's just all around a better way to do things. So please do not his/her. It just not a good way to do it. If you find yourself something/something anything, see if there's not a better way to do it, because chances are you are strangling out your sentences. When you file your tax return, be sure to keep your receipts for 7 years versus after filing a tax return, the taxpayer should keep all receipts for 7 years. Or address the reader as you. Again, this means you don't have to use a gendered pronoun. You can edit so that a pronoun is not necessary. As a last resort, it's becoming increasingly acceptable to use plural pronouns to refer to a singular subject to avoid gendered references. Personally, I consider using plural pronouns for singular subjects an acceptable strategy in exceptional cases. I'm all for whatever is most inclusive, so I say whatever includes the most people. Life is too short to make things more complicated. Whatever makes us more included is the best. So, concluding, takeaway points. Always aim to make your sentences as concise and as clear as possible. Start with the real subject of the sentences, ideally something physical and concrete. Give that subject a clear, concrete verb so that the action is easily visualized by a reader. Edit the rest of the sentence for conciseness by replacing filler words and expressions with short and direct ones. Finally, edit for clarity by replacing jargon and big fancy words that are designed to impress with short, simple, clear words that readers don't have to puzzle over. Thank you! And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know.